I'm Lilia Esi, and I have been involved with Taibu as, first of all, and most important, as a service user. Taibu is a place where I found that I could get the culturally appropriate service that I need, and actually, Taibu saved my life. In addition to my connection to Taibu in Canada, Ghana, the Caribbean as a whole, I developed culturally specific programs, African-centered programming for families, children, youth, for the community in general. I feel that it's really important that we're able to infuse African-centered principles and values in everything that we do, and we're able to see ourselves in and out of the community, whether it's in schools, community programs. So for the last several years, I've been focused on developing African-centered curriculum and developing programs within the community. Storytelling is a way of sharing and communicating our stories, our histories, our triumphs, our hardships. It's a way of passing down wisdom. And when we talk about storytelling, we focus on the oral tradition of storytelling, which has been part of our communities for centuries, from time immemorial. It's what sort of helped us get through adversities. It's what helped us share our medicines. It's what helped us understand which paths in a road to take when we were fleeing. And we told stories in different ways. We tell stories through our art. We tell stories through dance and movement. We tell stories through the giro and the person in our communities who it's their role to tell stories. Stories have been through time, through, South Africa, the men that work in the mines, they, through their gumboots, they beat their feet to tell stories. In America, stomping was telling stories. Around carnival time, masquerades were telling stories with the flourish of the costumes and a Juve, mimicking the masters and telling our own stories and our own narratives through our own expression. So storytelling, it's a wide range of different expressions in the Black community. And these are just a few. There are many others. And as we continue to talk, they'll pop into my mind. But these are just a few ways that we've been able to tell and share and preserve our stories. Well, it preserves our culture when we share stories, and sometimes we don't even realize where the stories come from. So, for example, when I think of a story that I learned as a child, or a folk character that I learned as a child was Anansi, and finding out later in years that Anansi story started in West Africa, and in different areas of the world, Anansi stories have moved as we've migrated. Caribbean people have migrated to different areas. Nancy is also known as Auntie Nancy in the Deep South, and Nancy is spelled Anansy or Anansi. And we're surprised when we come across people from different parts of the world, from Africa and the diaspora, and we realize that we share the same stories. So those have followed us around the generations. And Nancy stories and these different type of folk tale stories teach us wisdom and teach us keenness and teaches us ways to relate with the world, and not only with people, but with the environment, with plants and with animals and with the sky and so forth, with the rivers, with the seas. So these stories have told us and teach us how to preserve our relationship, not only with each other, but with the universe. I think we use and tell stories when we need to communicate. So I think of the men in the barbershop who spend hours and hours and hours in the barbershop just telling stories of their lives and what they're going through, what they're experiencing, and what they're seeing other people within their families and their community experience. You know, in the barbershops, they talk about parenting, they talk about relationships, they talk about, you know, violence that's happening in our communities. We tell stories at the dinner table. We tell stories at church. We tell stories when we're doing tea ceremonies in certain cultures. We tell stories, you know, in eulogies and celebrating people's lives and so forth. We tell stories when we want to put our children to sleep. You know, so stories are a very deep part of our culture, and sometimes we don't realize or recognize how significant our stories are. We tell stories we tell stories in our activism roles. We tell stories when we hit the streets and we want to share and we want to cry out for justice for our children, for our families, for our communities. We tell stories when we have needs. And we also tell stories in our dub poetry. We tell stories in our spoken word. There's so many different ways that we tell stories, and it's a form of expression that helps us share what we're feeling inside. It helps us share the oppression that we feel. It helps us share our joy. It helps us share our triumphs, our successes. It helps us share our histories and the ways that we got here. And for a long time, we were forbidden to tell our stories. Like if you look at history books, there are very few history books within a certain time that are published. So we had no choice but to tell stories in certain places that we could tell them quietly and we could tell them secretly. We've told stories under trees, under the moonlight, people coming together to share stories about their ancestry and their tribes and their families and their generations and so on. Throughout my experience, I've run talking circles in this community, in the Malvern community, with senior women. I've ran talking circles in this community with senior women. I've ran talking circles with young people. I've run talking circles with homeless youth. And I had a recent experience when I met with a group of young people that are experiencing living in a shelter right now. And we asked them the question, how do you demonstrate or how do you express your stress and your anger? And they started talking and talking and talking. And then they started realizing amongst each other that one, they share some of the same stress, and two, they share some of the same ways of dealing with stress that are really healthy. So some of them talked about going to Scarborough Bluffs and sitting by the water and expressing how they feel and talking into the water and having the water take away their pain and or their stress. And it occurred to them that just sitting and spending 2 hours talking to each other, they discovered so much about themselves. They discovered so much about ways of dealing with mental health and mental wellness. So I think coming together and having conversations in our community, face-to-face, having honest, transparent type of conversations about how we're feeling and having the safe spaces to do so, which I think is really important. A lot of times we don't have the safe spaces to do so. So a lot of intentional work went in and goes into creating safe spaces for people to be able to share as much or as little as they want, and also to be able to listen to stories, and not only stories that come from us speaking to each other. In this, era of technology, there are podcasts that people can listen to that we can share, videos. I recently shared with a group of people a video from Malidoma, and he talked about our gifts and healing. And, it was really profound because people never sort of heard these words before when it came to African-centered healing. So they're the tools that we have, but it's about creating the safe space where we can come together, of course, in ways that we celebrate and gather. We gather with food, we gather with music, we gather with connection, we gather with reaching out and welcoming each other. So when these type of spaces are connected, where people can see themselves reflected in the aesthetic of the room, in the music, in the food, in the scents and everything, we're able to have one other way and one other tool of healing through storytelling. Well, there's a stigma around mental health within our community, right? When we've been, I think, conditioned to keep on pushing through even when it's hard. And, I read somewhere that our oppressors didn't feel that we were sophisticated enough to have mental health challenges, to feel. We weren't seen as human at one point. So when it comes to research and when it comes to practices and so forth, it's not really set up for us to thrive, right? So when it comes to mental health, being able to erase those stigmas that have been built up over centuries will really be beneficial. And the different ways that I talked about sharing our stories as when it comes to mental health, there's not just one way of us understanding and learning, right? So when it comes to mental health, we have to share stories in different ways. So we have to share stories through our art. We have to share stories through music. One of the things that we know is that music can change our cortisol levels. It can decrease our stress. So more music and sounds around mental health geared towards the Black community on our Black radio stations could be helpful. Tools around tools around meditation that emphasizes that meditation and mental health are healthy ways of coping with mental health. Meditation is a healthy way of coping with mental health. So when it comes specifically to our mental health, being able to talk to us and relate to us in a way that we understand, tips and tools and practices, and as well to demystify the fact that when it comes to mental health, we need help, and we need to sometimes, most times, oftentimes, reach out to a professional. However, having said that, our mental health, the professionals, they need to, we talked about an African-centered model, an African-centered approach. They also need to embrace this African-centered approach. So when we go into spaces, it's not as clinical as a lot of spaces are that we go into. It's welcoming. They understand our language. They understand that the way that we relate to each other and the way that we talk. They understand our needs in terms of maybe childcare, transportation, and they understand a way to relate to us in a way that we no longer fear getting help. And the more that we expose folks to ways that they can demystify mental health and mental challenges, it makes it more accessible. I believe as time emerges and our culture emerges as well, we have to continually keep on top of the way young people and the way our community, newcomers and so forth, communicate. One of the things that we need to understand is as our society changes and the people that are becoming part of our different communities, we really need to understand how they communicate around family dynamics, around sharing of information, around sharing sensitive information, around asking for help or receiving help. Well, first we need to understand how people work, and then we can respond with the different types of stories that meet their needs. For a long time, our stories have been morphed in the media. We see ourselves in the media in a very negative viewpoint, if or when our stories are told in the media. So at some point, we need to take control of our own narrative and be able to tell our own stories. That's the only way I believe that we can have the widespread knowledge and the knowledge injected into the communities. And when we talk about the Black community, we're so diverse, you know? So not one way is the way that is the right way. I think it'll take multiple ways. And not only are we diverse, we have different intersectionalities. So a lot of the time, there's certain segments of our community that their stories get lost, like the LGBTQ community. You know, those stories for young people get lost. And a lot of times we talk to the general population, but we don't talk specifically to different pockets that we need to talk to. We have a seniors who are very lonely right now, and they're shut in a lot of times and isolated, and their stories don't get heard because they don't get seen. So we have to make sure that we not only think of programs, but we think of ways that we can see who it is that we're talking to and the different groups that we need to reach through storytelling. And as well, I talk about seniors. Are we capturing their stories enough? You know, I think of Sankofa looking back as we go forward. And are we practicing that principle enough when it comes to the libraries that are a ever-aging population that a lot of times we take for granted that we stand on the shoulders of the seniors and our ancestors as well. And for so long, our stories have been hidden or suppressed or omitted. So not only are we trying to capture the stories that are happening now, we're also trying to capture the stories of the past. So it seems like it's an ongoing quest for us to be seen and heard. And once someone feels seen and heard, it improves, you know, their self-esteem, their confidence. And we do know that as our young people start the school system, as much as they get a lot of reinforcement from home at a very young age, even before they start kindergarten, when they get into the school system, it's very disparaging. And very shortly after they enter their school career, they start to feel unseen, unheard, neglected, and they feel lost in a large part within the school system. So how can we ensure that strong enough stories are told to our young people so that on a continuous basis, they have that confidence in themselves and in their people, so that no matter what they're told, that they have, you know, a strength of a community and a strength of stories and narratives to fall back on. There is no one story. And when we share our stories of resistance, our stories of resilience, our stories of activism, joy, triumph, and so on, the stories allow us to see our strength and courage regardless of circumstance. And the stories of purpose, perseverance, love, determination, and emancipation. These stories encourage us to reflect on our history, our culture, our personal experiences, embracing both the triumphs and the challenges. And through our stories, we are able to gain wisdom, strength, and resilience for the present and for the future. And thinking again of Sankofa, which encourages self-care, healing, and the importance of mental well-being by recognizing our interconnectedness of our past, our present, and ourselves.